France is a symbol of culture, ideas, and the spirit of freedom, both timeless and contemporary. But to become what it is today, the country endured turbulent upheavals, where the old order collapsed and a new era began. Among the turning points that shaped European history, one chapter changed the course of a nation. Today, we will travel back in time, stepping into the late 18th century to a France teetering on the edge of collapse, where the fate of millions depended on the price of a loaf of bread, and where a revolution was about to rewrite the entire rulebook of human history. Welcome to the story of the French Revolution. I'm Alex, and now, let's begin. In the winter of 1788, the ink froze in the wells of Versailles. It was a cold so absolute that it seemed to arrest time itself. In Paris, the Seine turned into a silent highway of ice. Barges laden with firewood and grain were locked in place, miles from the markets where bread prices were already climbing with the ruthlessness of a mathematical function. Witnesses recorded that birds, solidified by the frost, fell from the sky in mid-flight. This was not merely weather. It was a stress test on a system that had reached its elastic limit. We often remember the French Revolution as a sudden explosion of noise, shouting mobs breaking glass, the thunder of cannons. But it began in silence. It began with the quiet, crushing physics of a caloric deficit. The ground was too hard to plough. The wheat harvest had already failed, beaten down by summer hailstorms. Now, the cold ensured that what little food remained could not move. This is the story of the French Revolution. It is not a story of heroes and villains, though history has supplied us with plenty of both. It is a story of a complex, interconnected machine, a monarchy, an economy, a social hierarchy that ran out of runway. It is the story of how a society hits a hard constraint, collapses, and then attempts to reassemble itself into a new, more efficient engine. To understand why the most powerful monarchy in Europe dismantled itself, we have to look past the pageantry of the court and into the ledgers. We must examine three structural pillars that were buckling under the weight of the 18th century. The first pillar was the debt. France was the geopolitical superpower of the age, but it was financing its dominance on a credit card it could no longer pay off. The American War of Independence had been a military triumph for France, but a financial catastrophe. The treasury was empty, serviced by loans with interest rates that consumed half the annual revenue. The second pillar was the calorie. The population of France had grown by 8 to 10 million souls over the century, but the agricultural technology to feed them had not kept pace. The margin between survival and starvation was razor thin. When the weather turned, that margin vanished. The third pillar was the gridlock of privilege. The nobility and the clergy, who owned the vast majority of the land, were largely exempt from taxes. The burden fell entirely on the third estate, the peasantry, the merchants, the workers, who were simultaneously being squeezed by the rising price of bread. The machine was seizing up, and there was no mechanic who could fix it without taking the whole thing apart. Consider the life of a peasant in early 1789. The tax on salt, the gabelle, is not just a fee, it is a system of forced consumption. You are required by law to buy a specific amount of salt at a price fixed by the king's tax farmers. Above you sits the lord of the manor. He owns the doves that eat your seeds, and you are forbidden from killing them. He owns the mill where you must grind your grain, taking a cut of the flour. This was the Ancien Régime. It was a society of orders, not individuals. Your rights depended not on your humanity, but on your corporate identity. For centuries, it had worked. The hierarchy was considered as natural as the stars. But in 1789, the feedback loops turned positive. The harvest failure reduced the supply of grain. The price rose. To buy bread, the peasant had to spend nearly 88% of their daily wage. This meant they stopped buying everything else. The textile mills fired their workers. These unemployed weavers then flooded into the cities, hungry and desperate, just as the price of bread hit its zenith. King Louis XVI was not a tyrant. He was a man of average intelligence who enjoyed locksmithing and hunting. He knew the system was broken. His ministers had tried to fix it. They proposed taxing the nobility, but every attempt at reform was blocked by the Parlement, the high courts run by the very nobility who would lose their exemptions. The French crown was trapped in a paradox. It was absolute in theory but paralyzed in practice. It could imprison a man with a letter, but it could not pass a budget. The only way out was to find new revenue, but the only people with money had the political power to refuse to pay. Facing a financial default, the king summoned the Estates General, a national assembly that had not met since 1614. It was an admission of defeat. The absolute monarch needed permission to tax. In May 1789, the deputies arrived in Versailles carrying the Cahiers de Doléances, the notebooks of grievances. These were not calls for revolution. They were polite, desperate requests. Lower the salt tax, fix the roads, stop the rabbits from eating the cabbage. But the moment they gathered, the system hit a logic error. The Estates General was designed to vote by order, not by head. The clergy had one vote. The nobility had one vote. The commoners, who represented 98% of the population, had one vote. 25 million people could be outvoted by 300,000. For 6 weeks, they stared at each other. The Third Estate refused to verify their credentials separately. They demanded a common assembly. The king hovered, indecisive. On June 20th, 1789, the deputies of the Third Estate arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors locked. It was likely a banal administrative error, but to the nervous deputies, it looked like a coup. It was raining. Seeking shelter, they moved to the nearest open building, the Royal Tennis Court. Inside, the air was stifling. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, an astronomer who had spent his life mapping the stable orbits of stars, stood on a table. They swore an oath, not to the king, but to the law. They vowed not to separate until they had written a constitution for France. In that moment, sovereignty migrated. It moved from the body of the king to the body of the assembly. It was a juridical revolution, executed with words. The signal traveled from Versailles to Paris, but in the capital, Paris was a city on edge. The price of bread had hit its highest recorded level. Rumors began to circulate. The king was gathering troops. Foreign regiments were camping on the Champ de Mars. They were coming to crush the assembly. The trigger was the dismissal of Jacques Necker, the finance minister. When the news hit the cafes of the Palais Royal, it was interpreted as a declaration of war. The cafes were the nervous system of the revolution. Camille Desmoulins, a young journalist, leaped onto a table outside the Café de Foire. He pulled a pistol from his coat. The diffusion of panic was instantaneous. The crowd needed two things: bread and gunpowder. They found 30,000 muskets at the Hôtel des Invalides, but no powder. The powder was stored in the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress with 8 towers, walls 10 feet thick, and a reputation as a dungeon of despotism. In reality, it held only 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and a deviant aristocrat. But symbols are heavy. The crowd did not see a nursing home for old soldiers. They saw the king's fist. The siege was chaotic. It was not a professional military operation. It was a swarm. The governor, the Marquis de Launay, hesitated. He attempted to negotiate, but the mechanics of a crowd are hydraulic. Pressure builds until it finds a release. The drawbridge chain was cut. The crowd surged in. The walls were breached, and the governor, Marquis de Launay, did not survive the siege. The fall of the Bastille wasn't just a military victory, it was the end of the old world's invincibility. The collapse of the centre sent a shockwave through the periphery. In the countryside, the system of authority simply evaporated. A rumour spread across France: the brigands are coming. Peasants believed that the aristocrats were hiring gangs to burn the wheat, a famine plot to starve the revolution. In response, they armed themselves. When the brigands didn't appear, the peasants turned their weapons on the chateau. They didn't just burn the houses, they burned the paper. They stormed the rooms where the feudal deeds were kept, the records of who owed what to whom. They destroyed the memory of the debt. It was a systematic formatting of the hard drive of feudalism. The National Assembly watched the smoke rising from the provinces with horror. They realized that if they did not act, they would lose the country. On the night of August 4th, they attempted a legislative exorcism. In a session that lasted until 2 a.m., the deputies stepped forward to renounce their privileges. In 6 hours, a social structure that had stood for 1,000 years was dismantled by vote. The feudal regime was abolished entirely. With the old house demolished, the revolutionaries began to build a new one using the only tool they trusted: reason. This was the Enlightenment applied to statecraft. The goal was standardization. The old France was a mess of overlapping jurisdictions where laws, taxes, and measurements changed every few miles. They wiped the map clean. In 1790, they divided France into 83 departments. The size of each department was calculated so that any citizen could travel to the capital city on horseback, conduct their business, and return home in a single day. They named them after rivers and mountains, stripping away the historical names of the provinces. They didn't stop at geography. For centuries, a foot in Paris was different from a foot in Marseille. The revolutionaries introduced the meter, defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator, a universal, natural standard accessible to all, owned by no one. They decimalized the currency. They decimalized the weight. They even attempted to decimalize time. The Republican calendar was the most radical experiment. They restarted history. September 22nd, 1792 became Day 1, Year 1. The 7-day week was abolished. In its place came a 10-day week with only 1 day of rest. It was efficient, it was rational, and the people hated it. But the most dangerous friction came from the church. In 1790, the Assembly passed the civil constitution of the clergy. It nationalized the church. Priests were to be elected by the people and required to swear an oath of loyalty to the constitution. This was the breaking point. Half refused. In the religiously conservative West, the Vendée, this was seen as an assault on the soul of the community. The peasants who had burned feudal deeds in 1789 now picked up their scythes to fight the revolution. By 1793, the revolution was at war with Europe, at war with the church, and at war with itself. The armies of Austria, Prussia, and Britain were pressing on the borders. The Vendée was in open revolt. The currency, the assignat, was collapsing. The assignat was paper money backed by the value of nationalized church lands. But the government, desperate for cash to fund the war, printed too many. The feedback loop of inflation kicked in. As the value dropped, they printed more, which made the value drop further. In Paris, the sans-culottes demanded a solution. They didn't want free trade, they wanted affordable bread. The government responded by building a new kind of machine: the terror. The terror was not just bloodlust. It was a bureaucracy of emergency management. Its executive arm was the Committee of Public Safety, 12 men working 16 hours a day. They centralized everything. To fight inflation, they passed the law of the general maximum. It set strict price limits on grain and made hoarding a capital crime. It was a command economy enforced by the guillotine. To fight the war, they decreed the levée en masse, the first total war draft in history. The young men would go to battle. The married men would forge arms. The women would make tents and clothes. The old men would stimulate courage. The guillotine was the perfect symbol for this regime. It was invented as a humanitarian gesture. It was efficient, painless, and egalitarian. It killed a king the same way it killed a pickpocket. On January 21st, 1793, it claimed Louis XVI. But the machine ran too hot. Robespierre believed that terror was nothing more than justice, prompt and severe. He tried to create a republic of virtue. He even invented a new state religion, the cult of the supreme being. On June 8th, 1794, he staged a massive festival. An artificial mountain was built. Robespierre descended from it, dressed in a sky blue coat, holding flowers. To the deputies watching, it looked like madness. Fear is a powerful, cohesive force, but it is unstable. When the French armies began to win, the justification for the terror evaporated. The deputies wondered, am I next? On 9 Thermidor, the feedback loop reversed. The convention shouted him down. Robespierre was arrested. He tried to shoot himself, but only shattered his jaw. The next day, the machine he had greased with blood claimed him. The fever broke, but the world had changed. The Ancien Regime was gone. The privileges were never restored. The land that had been seized from the church stayed with the peasants, creating a new class of small landowners. The systems of measurement remained. The meter conquered the world. The concept of the nation was born, a unified people speaking one language, obeying one law. 10 years after the Bastille fell, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. He was a child of the revolution, a meritocratic soldier who rose because the aristocratic officers had fled. He codified the revolution into law. The Code Napoleon enshrined equality before the law, property rights, and secular authority. It exported the revolution's operating system to half of Europe. The French Revolution was a tragedy of constraints. It was a collision between a medieval system and a modern population. It was driven by the price of bread and the debt of war. It cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but it also left us with the blueprint of the modern world: the left and the right, the metric system, the concept of human rights, the idea that a nation is not a collection of subjects, but a project of citizens. The ice on the Seine eventually melted. The ink thawed. But the history written in those years is indelible. We are still living in the world they built. Thank you for sticking around. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe the channel. I'm Alex, the History Traveler, and see you on the next journey.